Hello. While everyone else is concentrating on Iran, I'm going to have a few words about Turkey. But before I do, of course, I want to thank all my Subscribe Star subscribers and the ones on PayPal. Thank you very much. You're all a great help, really. And I want to remind everyone to click that subscribe button and watch the bell. I've had so many messages from people who tell me that they are subscribed and they're still not getting notifications. YouTube doing something, I don't know what. But back to Turkey, and I'm not talking about the Christmas one. I want to establish some background here. In the 1920s, Kemal Atatürk, he'd been a brilliant military tactician during the First World War. The Ottoman Empire weighed in on the side of Germany in that conflict, and Atatürk, almost alone, proved himself a formidable opponent for the mighty British Army. But he was very much on his own in a corrupt, decomposing administration, and the Turks lost the war. After it was over, Atatürk, established a coup really and took over. And the Turkish Republic was started in 1924, at which point Atatürk embarked on a programme of modernisation which involved the women getting the vote. He established compulsory primary education for all, and he abandoned the Arabic script in favour of a Latinised one. And that was really important to separate Turkey from the rest of the surrounding Muslim world. In fact, he did what he could to erase as much as was possible of the idea of an Ottoman caliphate. But he wasn't a saint either. Some of his methods were very brutal. That's a fact. And it's a fact much glossed over by people in the West because it was to their advantage to have Turkey brought up to Western standards. And so there was a lot of prevarication about how Atatürk actually achieved his westernisation. And the Turkish people, broadly speaking, were with him. His idea was to create a Turkish nationalism to replace the caliphate and a secular Turkish identity. As I said, to separate Turkey from the influence of the Arab world. And it succeeded to a great extent. And by the 1970s, Turkey was well known as an industrial powerhouse and a trading nation. And the men went to work every day in factories and workshops and created GDP instead of sitting around in coffee houses all day while their women folk toiled in the fields, which was still quite common at that time in the rest of the Levant. But like many other schemes of that sort, it contained some minor and insignificant details that have recently turned into major and extremely significant ones. You see, all this time I've been talking about the sophisticated European part of Turkey, but there's a huge hinterland, an area broadly called Anatolia, and that remained largely untouched, not completely. There's industry there, of course, and trading and all the rest of it. But still, it's not as developed as the Western European corner of Turkey. Originally, that area used to have large communities of Armenians and Greeks who had been there for thousands of years. They were the urbane and sophisticated group in that part of Turkey and contributed much to the local culture. But they were slaughtered by the Young Turks during the First World War. Well over a million of them. And what was left were driven out one way or the other by Atatürk's Turkish nationalism. I'm not, by the way, saying that Atatürk was personally responsible for that. There were many in those areas who gladly took the law into their own hands and then looted, of course. But it could be done because it was all part of a sort of wave. And after that, Anatolia became mostly Muslim and fairly backward, as usually happens in situations like that, because it was only the peasants who were left. They haven't remained peasants, of course. There is industry, but in general, the people are more religious, the women are less literate and educated, the economy more agricultural and traditional. And 80 years after Ataturk, those guys in Anatolia have outbred the metropolitans. And they're the ones who keep Tayyip Erdogan in power now. And why, you may ask, am I going through this? Well, because despite Ataturk's best efforts, the people have not forgotten the Ottoman Empire, and many of them want it back. And that certainly seems to be the mindset of Mr. Erdogan. He wants influence all over the world, but starting with the immediate neighbourhood, he's been angling for influence all over the Middle East, and Turkey has a lot going for it. For a start, the main sources of water in Syria and Iraq originate in the Anatolian hills, and Erdogan has embarked on a gigantic programme of dam building across the lakes that serve those rivers. Sooner or later, Turkey will be able to turn off the taps and tell Syria and Iraq exactly what they want them to do, and they'll do it, or they'll go to war. And for that reason, Erdogan is also building up an impressive military, getting his supplies from anyone who will sell them, America or Russia, doesn't matter. And then there's another element, the refugees. Kudos to Turkey. It's not much talked about over here, but Turkey's taken in millions of refugees, millions, about 4 million, I believe. It really has borne the brunt of the various disruptions in the Levant, all the time battling with ISIS as well. So even with the international aid for help with the refugees, Turkey can hold its head high on the refugee issue. And seeing as it's just about the only country left in the area with any stability, Turkey, the only Muslim country that is, Turkey has turned into a regional power again. And with its influence in Syria and Iraq, it's starting to cover territory it previously ruled over during Ottoman times. But the Ottoman Empire used to extend further than that. It used to govern in various ways most of North Africa as well. The borders of the empire ebbed and flowed a bit, but this is what it looked like in 1878. So it should give us some cause to worry that Turkey has now taken upon itself the task of keeping the peace in Libya, which country, you will notice, used to be part of the old Ottoman Empire. You may ask why anyone should mind that Turkish troops are in Libya getting shot at instead of Americans or British soldiers. Well, why shouldn't we just heave a sigh of relief? Well, it goes like this. Libya's two greatest exports are oil and refugees. Libya is the route through which desperate sub-Saharan Africans hope to escape to the greener fields of Europe. And anyone who controls the flow has a lot of leverage over Europe. You know, you don't do what we want, we just let the boats through. Something that Turkey doesn't have. There's a lot of oil in Libya. Turkey doesn't have oil. But controlling the oil in Libya would give Turkey a lot of leverage in the power stakes as well. At present, there's a civil war going on in Libya. Were you aware of that? Perhaps you've noticed the universal silence about it. And that's because it's a big worry and not convenient for Western governments to talk about. The nominal ruling power is called the GNA, the Government of National Accord, which reminds me of all those tyrannies called the Democratic Republic of. Anyway, the GNA is headed by, well, at least nominally headed by, Fayez al-Serraj. And last December, the GNA signed an agreement with Turkey to allow Turkish troops into Libya to help out. Because they're in a bit of a tussle with General Khalifa Haftar, who fled Gaddafi some years ago but now is back, and with the support of the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. I hope you're keeping up with this. The UAE and Egypt are evidently two sets of political entities in the Middle East who don't want Turkey to get into North Africa. Haftar already has control over most of the oil-producing areas of Libya. The thing is, the Russians are also involved. Well, since their only way out of the Black Sea is through a neck of water overlooked by Turkey, it makes sense. Meanwhile, relations with the United States have deteriorated. The USA has spent years buttering up the Turks because they were a bulwark against Russia. That went well, didn't it? So they've pulled out their reserve weapon, really. Just this last December, the Senate passed a resolution recognising the Armenian genocide. It's amazing how things don't get recognised until they're politically expedient, isn't it? Over a million Armenians died during the genocide, and they've only decided now to recognise it. But also America's started to withdraw from a joint military programme it had with Turkey involving the sale of fighter planes and missiles. They say they're worried about the Russians getting the technology. Well, that may be so, but there are other things as well. The whole thing is, as you will have realised, a pretty awful mess, in my opinion. But the important thing to say about it is that studying this might be one of the reasons for Iran's behaviour recently. Its constant prodding at the limits of American patience, for instance, and its desperate attempts to gain a foothold in the Yemen. Their bid for local hegemony is receding as their own people are rioting, feeling the financial bite of funding all those terrorist organisations, and even Syria and Iraq are kicking against Iranian influence. I have to tell you, this paper here is an American news source, but it does record events that actually happened. And then there's something I can only speculate about. How did the Americans know that Soleimani was in Baghdad airport when he was there? Who do you think told them? I doubt it was anyone in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It could have been, but to my mind, it seems far more likely it was someone on the Iraqi side what done it. And I'm sure the Iranians will have drawn similar conclusions, which sort of means their foothold in Iraq at the very least might not be as secure as they'd like to think, or as they'd like us to think. And Syria may be big buddies now, but when those dams get finished on the sources of the Tigris and the Euphrates, as I said, they'll be better friends with Turkey than with Iran. And if Turkey gets a foothold in Libya as well, they'll be calling the shots there too, and not just in North Africa. There's an awful lot of oil in Libya and a lot of fleeing Africans to take into consideration. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.